Hey everyone, welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria, Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jamie Cheeslice. This is part 3 in our series on Danny Casolaro and the Octopus Murders. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guests, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Our series uncovers the true story of the Octopus Murders. In our guest assessment, the Netflix film titled American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders, that won an Emmy in June in the investigative documentary category, misrepresents facts, draws fictional conclusions, and harms reputations and legacies. Our distinguished guests again include Peter Osborne, Australian physicist, political researcher, and whistleblower, his colleague and attorney, Daniel P. Sheehan, constitutional and public interest attorney and legal activist. Some of the notable cases he's been involved in are the Pentagon Papers, Karen Silkwood, and Iran-Contra. In part 2, we showed that Danny's death was not a suicide. He was silenced. But to stop there would miss the bigger picture, because this story isn't only about one man's murder. It's about what he uncovered, the structure he called the octopus. The octopus, in Danny's words, was a hidden system, an organism with tentacles stretching across finance, intelligence, organized crime, and global politics. Its strength came from how these spheres overlapped. Banks collapsed, covert funds disappeared, armed shipments moved in the shadows, and yet the same names surfaced again and again. On Friday, August 9th, 1991, Danny reportedly collected 5 boxes of documents from the IRS's Computer Center. These files weren't trivial. They were said to contain proof of the connections he had been mapping for years. Consider the names that surfaced in these boxes. Mario Renda, a banker tied to laundering cartel and mob money through the savings and loan system. His activities helped trigger the financial wreckage of the 1980s. But he wasn't just a rogue banker, he was a conduit. Robert Booth Nichols, arms dealer and alleged intelligence asset, a man who could move between covert agencies and criminal enterprises with ease. Harold Okimoto, linked to banking channels in Hawaii, financial pipelines that investigators suspected were used to move covert funds through the Pacific, and Abraham Ali, less visible but no less important, appearing in overlapping investigations as a facilitator inside the shadow economy. Each man was a tentacle, but the octopus was the body, the architecture that tied them together. 5 boxes of IRS records would not have mysteriously disappeared from Danny's possession if they did not contain connective records, transaction trails, intelligence overlaps, names, dates, offshore accounts. And this is why the boxes mattered. They suggested that the octopus wasn't just a metaphor or a conspiracy theory. It was documented. It operated through official channels, financial institutions, and covert cutouts. And it thrived because each part could deny responsibility while serving the larger system. Yes, Danny was unequivocally murdered because of what he found. He had evidence of the octopus, a structure that protects itself through silence, disappearance, and erasure. Part 3, then, is not the story of a single man's death. It is the story of a system of power that consumes its challengers, a system that makes records vanish and journalists with them. Thank you. Danny, please set the scene and let us know what hasn't yet been exposed. Thank you.
Fine. Thanks, Gloria. Yeah, I'm Dan Sheehan. People may have recalled that name because I was the chief counsel that prepared and filed the major federal criminal complaints against the off-the-shelf enterprise, which people perceive as Oliver North's famous or infamous off-the-shelf enterprise with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim and a whole group of others that were the subject matter of a series of major congressional public hearings that were held back in the 1980s. What people remember is that the books were closed on that off-the-shelf enterprise with basically a number of major indictments that were brought by the special prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, who indicted some 14 different high-level officials of the Reagan-Bush administration, and was in the process of proceeding to prosecute those first 14 defendants in order to work his way on all the way up to and including the Vice President of the United States in the Iran-Contra crisis, George H.W. Bush. But Bush had become president during the course of that investigation, and he ended up pardoning all of those people, basically, that were indicted by the special prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh. And in despair, Lawrence Walsh basically retired, saying that it was clear that there was not an adequate will on the part of Congress or either of the major political parties in the United States to do anything about what they had revealed. And therefore, it was useless for him to continue with his prosecutions. That as the party that brought the original criminal complaint and also prosecuted a major civil lawsuit against this off-the-shelf enterprise, I've been asked to explain what it is that that enterprise was part of. Because it turns out that the off-the-shelf enterprise, the so-called off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing, covert operations enterprise that was a private entity was at the core of that particular scandal. Okay, and so therein lies a tale. That is what Danny Casolaro was investigating, back in 1991. That is what he was gathering documented proof to show was in operation when he was murdered. Okay, and so that people are now asking, what is it that he had come to find out about, and how do you explain this to people who pay like 1% of the amount of attention to the reality that we're talking about that they would need to pay in order to even understand it? And that's why this enterprise gets away with what they're doing. So what I want to do is I want to lay out for you, almost as the opening statement of a presentation to a jury. The listeners of this broadcast are the jury. You are the jury. And so I want to be able to capsulize what it is that we're going to be telling you and what the expert witnesses that we can call will tell you the details of, okay? The bottom line is that what we have discovered, and we have the documented proof to establish, is that the Central Intelligence Agency basically set up an operation going on all around the world through its operators of a major criminal operation, which from the very beginning in 1945 had commandeered $1.2 trillion in gold out of the Philippines that had been buried there by the Japanese toward the end of the war, when they thought that our United States and allies were going to be invading Japan following the surrender of Germany in May of 1945. Between May and December of 1945, the Japanese Imperial military smuggled gold out of Japan, the Japanese islands, and moved them into the Philippines and buried them in 176 separate troves. Each of those 176 troves contained $100 billion in gold, bullion, silver, platinum, and huge 50-gallon drums filled with diamonds and rubies and sapphires and pearls, other precious gems that had been stolen from 1932 all the way through to 1945 by a special unit of the Japanese military. This money, this $1.2 trillion that they punched into 12 of these troves right at the end of World War II. They commandeered that money and they took it and they put it in a bank in Switzerland. And they began using that $1.2 trillion to fund covert operations. And when the Central Intelligence Agency came into being in 1947, they basically began to utilize those funds. And what they did is they began engaging in a covert war around the world, working in alliance with remnants of the Third Reich that were, as people know, were smuggled out of Europe. They were brought down into South America, into Argentina and Brazil and other Latin American countries. And our American Central Intelligence Agency began working with them because they were ostensibly dedicated anti-communists. And so that they began this major alleged anti-communist campaign around the world in secret. In fact, it wasn't so much an anti-communist undertaking as a pro-capitalist undertaking in favor of the major corporations of the Allied countries that they were seeking to assert and to maintain continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials that were deemed to be necessary for our major corporations in order for them to give jobs, have business, stimulate the economies of the Western countries, et cetera. This was a major ideological and economic war that was being mounted secretly through the Central Intelligence Agency and their allies around the world. What we have discovered is that the off-the-shelf enterprise of Oliver North was an attempt on the part of the Central Intelligence Agency after the failure of the Vietnam War. When the Vietnam War that was mounted by the United States between 1954 and 1974, a 20-year period, that when they finally collapsed and had to flee basically from Vietnam and Southeast Asia in 1974 under the presidency of Richard Nixon, they withdrew their forces from there. The Central Intelligence Agency at that time was upset that their warfare in support of the transnational corporate interests of the United States and the Western powers was being frustrated by being denied access to that land base that they wanted to have to get access to the Southeast Asian resources. And they decided they were going to continue to mount this major war, despite the fact that a given administration, Richard Nixon's administration in that case, had basically abandoned the field. And they began a major covert operation assembling a global enterprise in the private sector that they were in fact hiding in the shadows, not necessarily claiming to have the access to the official government power, but that they were setting up private businesses and a private enterprise to mount their continuing war on behalf of what they deemed to be the national interests of the United States, waiting for another administration. Because as you know, when Richard Nixon resigned and was replaced by his vice president, his vice president, Gerald Ford, failed to win election in 1976. And President Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. And a whole bunch of investigations began of the CIA and other activities from 1976, 77, 78, was all under the United States Congress investigating the Central Intelligence Agency, what their covert operations were that had been going on around the world, et cetera. And so therefore, there was this interregnum, this period from 1976 to 1980, during which there was an effort on the part of Congress to come forward and investigate what kind of activities the Central Intelligence Agency and their allies around the world were in fact engaging in. And that revealed a whole lot that we've heard about, the so-called Church Committee, under the auspices of Senator Frank Church from Idaho. Bottom line is that they moved forward and revealed a bunch of the criminal activity the CIA was engaged in, but they did not, in fact, stop them. And what happened is when the forces of the CIA covert operations and this transnational corporate capitalist venture were re-engaged, they struck back against President Jimmy Carter, got him removed from office in 1980, and they put in Ronald Reagan and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, who had been the previous director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so George Bush Sr., from the position in the vice presidency under Ronald Reagan, continued pushing forward this agenda of the Central Intelligence Agency. And this is what we're dealing with here. George H.W. Bush, who is the grandson of George Herbert Walker and the son of Prescott Bush, who was now the vice president of the United States, began organizing around the world the resuscitation of this massive covert operation that was going on around the world. And what they did is and they ended up with Ed Meese, who was originally the chief of staff for Ronald Reagan, the president, who then became the attorney general in the second term. They began trying to figure out how they could establish the covert operations around the world that are functioning in the dark, in the black, and they could do so exercising the color of authority of the United States government, but keeping the operations going largely through these private enterprises that they had going. What we did at our institute is we stumbled across one of the operations, which was the off-the-shelf enterprise, which was perceived to be run by Oliver North as a liaison from the official government. The bottom line is that what we discovered, myself and our investigators, in doing the Iran-Contra investigation, we discovered that there was this worldwide network that was functioning around the world, and that it wasn't just the one operation that was going on down in Central America to try to overthrow the government of Nicaragua, the Sandinista government. This was part of a much larger enterprise, a sprawling enterprise that was going on around the world. And it was in that context that I was contacted by Danny Casolaro. Danny Casolaro, who was an investigative journalist there outside of Washington, D.C., called me, and he and I were having telephone conversations about the larger enterprise that these off-the-shelf enterprise was part of. And he told me that he was getting set to go outside of town to go on a mission, and he was going to be meeting some people there, and was going to be getting documented proof of the specific contours of this large operation that was going on. Okay, and what we're here to talk with you about here today, in part 3 of this series, is what that larger operation was and still continues to be, that is functioning now. Okay, and it was functioning under the aegis at that time of Vice President George H.W. Bush. For the entire period from 1980 through both terms of the Reagan-Bush administration until 1988, and then when George Bush was elected president in 1988, that he continued in place until 1992. And George H.W. Bush becomes the kind of center point of coordinating this operation that was going on around the world, utilizing the person who he appointed to be the chief of covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency when George Bush was the CIA director temporarily under the president. Okay, so this is what we're talking about here. And to understand this simply, what we're telling you is that George H.W. Bush was part of a massive criminal syndicate working with James Baker, who was one of his principal advisors, who became Secretary of State, and that they were running a criminal operation around the world that was in fact still utilizing this gold that had been pilfered from the Philippines at the end of World War II, $1.2 trillion. And that is in 1945 terms of gold being $32 an ounce. Gold now is like $1,400 an ounce. So it gives you some idea of the scale of what this gold was that they had. And they would keep the gold in different banks, and they would issue gold certificates, which they were using to finance covert operations. And they then expanded into running heroin operations out of Southeast Asia in unity with the mafia. I happen to know this because one of my incarnations, I was the legal attorney in the office of F. Lee Bailey. F. Lee Bailey, to my surprise, was the attorney for Santos Trafficante. And Santos Trafficante is the one who was helping work with the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA station chief, Theodore Shackley, who turns out to be the person that was appointed to be the head of worldwide covert operations by George Bush Sr. Okay, this alliance that the CIA established with the mafia in the criminal drug smuggling, in the utilization of this secret cache of gold, which was ever expanding in value, because all they were doing is they were issuing gold certificates on the gold, but the gold was increasing in price all regularly. And so it migrated from $32 an ounce up to $1,400 an ounce. And so this was a rich source of covert operations that they were engaged in. What we've discovered and becomes the key to the message that we're trying to get through to you today is that Ed Meese, when Ronald Reagan was elected and George Bush was serving as his vice president, that Ed Meese had become the attorney general in the second term of that administration. He hit upon a very particular tactic that this criminal enterprise that was functioning largely under the aegis of George H.W. Bush Sr., that they were going to get access to a particular computer program that was called the PROMIS software. That had been developed by a corporation called the Inslaw Corporation, the head of which was Bill Hamilton. And Ed Meese, through a series of detailed activities, stole this technology from Bill Hamilton. And he brought it in under the auspices of using it to systematize all of the cases of the United States attorneys all around the country in his capacity as Attorney General of the United States, that he was in charge of all of the dozens and dozens of offices around the country of the U.S. attorneys. And he said that there are thousands of cases that are going on. And what we want to use this AI technology that has been a preliminary form of artificial intelligence to be able to store all of the information about all of the U.S. attorneys' cases and be able to search those cases using AI, or artificial intelligence. What happened, however, is Ed Meese, when he got his hands on this particular software, this particular beginning of the artificial intelligence, what he did is said, look, what we can do is this criminal enterprise that Ed Meese was working in now with George H.W. Bush as the vice president. What we can do is we can offer this technology to all of our allies, and we can use this at the Central Intelligence Agency to store all of our intelligence information in, and we can search through the thing and be able to track terrorists, to track espionage operations that are going on. And what they decided to do is, over and above using it themselves, they were going to use the PROMIS software. They were going to provide it to the SWIFT banking system. And so that they provided to the SWIFT banking system. But what they did is they put a backdoor into this PROMIS software. They put a bug in the software. And so that when they provided it to the SWIFT banking system, this criminal enterprise was able to monitor all of the financial activity that was going on through the SWIFT banking system. They could monitor all of it in real time. Then they also decided that they were going to give this new bugged promise software, this AI software, they were going to provide it to all of their allies so they could use it in their intelligence organizations, which means that this criminal enterprise was going to have access to all of the intelligence data of all of our allies as well. And then they decided they were going to also make this promise software with this secret backdoor in it, this bug in it, that they were going to provide it to all of the law enforcement agencies in all of the allied countries in the West, so that they got access to all of the law enforcement activity, they got access to all of the intelligence activity, they got access to all of this, the secret banking activity that was going on. And so George H.W. Bush with Ed Meese and James Baker and the other people that were running this criminal enterprise, they were sitting on top of the world. That they were basically running the world. Okay, and that's what we're talking about here. This is what Danny Casolaro discovered. The fact is, George H.W. Bush was the de facto head of this criminal syndicate that was functioning all around the world. And what they were doing is they were operating this criminal enterprise of massive drug smuggling, massive money laundering, illegal gold shipments going on around the world, toppling different governments, assassinating people at will on behalf of their criminal enterprise. But they were doing it under the color of pursuing the national interests of the United States, and therefore the national interests of their allies and the national interests of these people under this new Northern Industrial Alliance. That's what George Bush was doing. That's what his plan was. This operation, this covert octopus with various tendrils going out around the world, was running under the authority of George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., and James Baker, his brain trust child, and with Ed Meese, and with a whole series of other people that you're going to hear about, Bill Casey and others. This is the story. The story of the octopus is a lot more than, but very importantly, part of the story of the murder of Danny Casolaro. That is a window in to what it is that was going on.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Danny, that was really very informative for everybody. And maybe, yeah, we can draw Peter into the conversation. Yeah. Well, I don't know if Danny, you want to address him, or Peter, if there's some new revelation, or maybe just, briefly address for the audience how you got into this topic, and then some of the major new revelations you've come up with as to why Danny Casolaro was murdered.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. The Five Eyes is an alliance between the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. I have a website that I call the Sixth Eye. It is the Cabal, a private intelligence agency, alliance by Ted Shackley and George Bush and Alexander Haig and several others that I've identified, that are overarching control of what intelligence knows and what intelligence does. I can prove that. In January 2001, I'm actually a witness in a federal parliamentary privileges committee investigating threats made against me by a company owned by Rupert Murdoch. I had shut down $2 billion of tax fraud in Australia, and his company was identified as the worst offender. I knew that because I was the whistleblower. I picked up the phone at the recommendation of a couple of veteran investigative journalists in Australia who were researching Promise, the Promise software, and Wackenhut, getting into the private prison systems in Australia. And they had covered my story about being threatened and asked if I knew anything about this particular area. And I did some research and then realised it's Murdoch's company. I picked up the telephone and called William Hamilton, president of Inslaw Inc., for the first time, introducing myself. And I asked him a very simple question. Bill, do you know a company called Computer Power Group? And he said, I'm in shock. No one's ever asked me that. He said, yes. They were introduced to me by IBM, the president and of Australia and the chairman of US, to meet with him at a hotel in Boston. In 1982, requesting to become his distributor for the Inslaw's Promus software. I said, really? I worked for them. Second, did you know that Rupert Murdoch owned that company? He said, no. I never knew that. I asked him what happened. He said, they took the software tapes. They dumped him in 1984, claiming they could never sell a copy of it. And I said to him, that's not true. They actually developed the software called the Lean software, put in at Austrac, which is equivalent to FinCEN, for tracking all money laundering with artificial intelligence. I know that for a fact because I worked for them. In 2004, Bill introduces me to Michael Riconosciuto, and also a veteran investigative journalist from Canada, TV producer Gordon Savell, who is wanting to write a book on it. So we joined up. Michael Riconosciuto wrote letters to me telling me that he testified in court that the first application was for the fusion of all computer databases for NATO and the US Navy for the tracking of Soviet submarines for the command fire control systems for the Trident submarine. Second application, when it was modified, was for tracking and facilitating covert SWIFT banking transactions, and it was installed at Transaction Technologies at Citibank. Third, the modified software was renamed the Lean software and sold to the Australian government. No one knew that that was Rupert Murdoch's company that put that in. So I also have all the annual reports because I worked for Murdoch's company. They actually developed all the artificial intelligence SWIFT banking tracking software and fusion of all intelligent databases for James Baker. I have the contracts. I have the press releases of all that. It is also the same software that was identified when FBI raided Robert Hanson's house and found the name of the ambassador, let's say the assistant to James Baker, who resigned in January 2001 before 9/11, as there was an investigation that a laptop was missing with all that artificial intelligence software developed by Rupert Murdoch's company. His name's on...
Say who Robert Hanson was?
Robert Hanson is the FBI agent that was arrested for selling secrets to the Russians. And articles are released in February 2001 in interviews that he reportedly had sold the Promus software to the Russians, and it was given to Osman bin Laden. Now, what's important about this? The ambassador...
I think you need to stand back for a second.
Roy,
I want to repeat what you just
resigned, and I've got a photograph of him with the press releases of Rupert Murdoch's company with the artificial intelligence software being used in Saudi Arabia by James Baker for the planning of...
This is just a point of information. You're referring to Osama bin Laden as how?
The allegation is that FBI agent Robert Hanson had sold a copy of the artificial intelligence Promus software to the Russians, the Russian mafia, who had given it to Osama bin Laden. I've got all the press releases. But what's more important than that, the ambassador, when resigning during the investigation, is now appointed immediately to become the vice chairman for Kissinger and Associates.
Yeah, tell the people what role you think Kissinger and Associates has played consistently in this octopus criminal enterprise.
Kissinger, and so now I'll go back to January 2001. At the same time, I'm in a privileges committee being threatened, and it's under investigation by the federal parliament, by Murdoch's company. I've now notified Bill Hamilton that the company that had it and did the artificial intelligence also developed the software for James Baker. It turns out that I'm also providing evidence of $6 trillion of gold bullion being laundered through Australians' banks and Citibank using the Promus software, Swift banking software, to United Nations Investigation Committee, because our program with the federal government and United Nations for an encryption authority, Computer Center, being set up by me, together with the Australian federal government and also KPMG and my partners, John Hopkins institutions, was destroyed by a bogus prince coming from the Philippines who works out of the office of Ferdinand Marcos, donating $1 billion to our program. And I have all the legal evidence that he's working with CIA, with Citibank, laundering $6 trillion of stolen gold bullion from Russia, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, China, the Philippines, through Citibank, and it all goes to Project Hammer, CIA Operation Still Point. I have the court case documents, the testimonies of all the people from NSC and CIA operatives, and the only other person who has that record of the court case and includes letters to Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, and President George W. Bush, with the details of the accounts at Citibank for $6 trillion of gold bullion, is located in the private library of Henry Kissinger. For it to be there and nowhere else, it shows that Henry Kissinger and Frank Colucci and A.B. Krongard, who was the director of John Hopkins Medicine, who I exposed in a TV documentary on Australian TV in 2004, in November 2004. And on the following week, I'm visited by no other than Robert Booth Nichols, comes to Australia to make death threats against me, telling me that my research is upsetting the neocons and all my problems lead to Alexander Haig. That is all documented. And then at the same time, I'm asked to sign legal agreements with a company owned by former President Gerald Ford, offering to negotiate a $100 million settlement for me with John Hopkins, and they're bringing in General Brent Scowcroft to do the negotiations for me. He happened to be also the managing director of Kissinger and Associates as well.
Okay, so would you say, Peter, that the Kissinger and Associates is a function or a functionary of this international fascist cabal?
Absolutely. Daniel Casolaro had the BCCI checks for 1 million, 4 million, plus all the accounts of Monte Carlo, all the transactions used for the tow missiles. I don't know if the public knows that Kissinger and Associates were acquiring BCCI 2 months before all the directors of BCCI were indicted in July 1991, 4 weeks before Danny Casolaro's murdered.
Okay, tell the people what the BCCI bank was. Many of them may not recall what that was, Peter.
Okay, it was referred to as the Bank of Crooks used by CIA for money laundering drugs and arms. Not only that, I'll now declare on your program, I've recovered all the records of Nukunahan Bank from the Royal Commissions in Australia that were confidential. Second, I have all your reports and investigations done by Senator Kerry and Jack Blum. And I have all the financial annual reports of BCCI. I'm going to tell you on your program something that even Senator Kerry didn't find, that 3 of the directors of Nukunahan Bank in the Cayman Islands were also full directors of BCCI until 1992, with all the money laundering of the transactions of the drugs and arms going through BCCI. It is the continuation of everything that Ted Shackley, Michael Hand had set up. I also have the evidence that just before Nukunahan Bank is shut down with the apparent suicide of Frank Nugan, who's found by the Australian police with a business card of William Colby as their legal advisor in his wallet, Thomas Clines and President Somoza of Nicaragua are in the process of doing an acquisition of Nukunahan Bank. That is now the continuation of everything from Nukunahan Bank, money laundering the drugs and arms in Australia, gold bullion from Ferdinand Marcos, which is evident. Second, continues with the same directors of BCCI, with CIA, with Ted Shackley, with Thomas Clines, with everyone, continuing right through to the indictment of all the directors of BCCI. And the only person who's got the smoking gun of the evidence that's going to get them all convicted was Danny Casolaro. He had the evidence. He actually, 4 days before he's found murdered, Lawrence Walsh has indicted Richard Secord and Dwayne Claridge, who are involved with Ted Shackley and Michael Ledeen, Adnan Khashoggi and Manicur Gorbanafar, with the tow missiles, which was financed by the Kuwait royal family. And I have the recorded interviews with the last girlfriend of 4 weeks with Danny Casolaro. She's paid $10,000 to stay with the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait at the Watergate Hotel during the week that Danny's murdered.
Okay, so what you're saying here is that this thing that people know about, the Iran-Contra scandal, about the sale of tow missiles to the Hezbollah in violation of the prohibitions by Congress, that was at the core of the Iran-Contra scandal that went down so many years ago, is a direct function of this criminal cabal. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Right. And so that if people are wondering why it is that George Bush Sr., when he became president, pardoned the people that were being indicted by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, the Iran-Contra Special Prosecutor, to shut down that investigation, it is because Lawrence Walsh was pursuing George Bush Sr. as a principal operations person of the off-the-shelf enterprise. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. In fact, we have our recorded interviews now. When I say we, veteran investigative journalist Gordon Savell filed an access for Freedom of Information access request in 2004. We were blocked for over 20 years, 21 years, telling us that it's top secret and that it's sealed. and we couldn't work out why, given that it was ruled a suicide. But now,
Peter, you just jump back to the Casolaro thing.
yeah,
Okay, but I'm just saying that people have heard about the Iran-Contra scandal in all of the major public hearings that were held by the United States Congress into that, and they realized that it was George Bush Sr. that pardoned everybody and stopped all of those investigations. And that what we want to do is want people to understand that Danny Casolaro was threatening to basically break open that entire case. That we had already presented, tons of evidence to Senator John Kerry and to Jack Blum, his major investigator, showing them all the details of what was going on in the Iran-Contra scandal, and showing that it tracked all the way back up to George Bush and his national security advisor, Donald P. Gregg. And yet, all of a sudden, they shut down that whole investigation, saying that, that it was too complicated. They really couldn't figure out who was who because there were too many foreign names involved. And they closed that investigation as soon as George Bush pardoned all of those key people. We just want people to relate what it is that we're talking to you about here with things that you may have remembered kind of vaguely in the past about this big Iran-Contra scandal, that if you remember that George Bush Sr. is the one that pardoned everybody and stopped that investigation.
Okay, I'll answer your question there. Our recorded interviews with Trey Casolaro, who we've been trying to help get justice for all these years, he confirms that in the shoe of Danny Casolaro, the Martinsburg police found a note hidden under the inner sole of his shoe. It had the name of George Bush Sr., George Pender, Robert Booth Nichols, and Richard Helms, and several others. But number one name was George Bush Sr. was on the list, and it's hidden in the sole of his shoe when he was in Martinsburg, when he went down to get all the evidence of the investigation files on Mario Renda and Robert Booth Nichols. Why is that important? Because Mario Renda goes back to the savings and loans scandals, and I have traced, now this part's important, I just want to let you know, in 2001, after being destroyed by John Hopkins and CIA and NSA, there's a copy of my passport at the NSA's research center, the John Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, on the week of the 5th of June, 2001, 3 months before 9/11. I'm invited to meet all the directors. They're setting me up to destroy me in a major fraud scandal, which I didn't fall for. I caught them. And I discover the architect of Echelon, which is runs at Pine Gap in Australia, is involved. And that's very important because the PromoSwift software was integrated for NSA, CIA, and the person that managed that project, I have all the memos, contracts, and official records of CIA. I recovered them because over years, when people die, everyone forgets what it is that they've got to cover up. I have the official reports that the software for Swift banking infiltration with the Promus software with NSA and CIA was developed by Earl Bryan's companies Hadron Inc., Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group, and their partner Wang Labs and IBM. I have the official records. More important, I have the resumes of all the people who flew to Australia to develop all the Promus software with Computer Power Group to put in for the lean software for tracking SWIFT banking, developed the SWIFT network in Belgium and Virginia. I have the official photographs and records of them, and their resumes show that they flew to Australia to work with Rupert Murdoch's company in 1982. But,
So Peter, so tell me, tell the people, what do you think Rupert Murdoch was doing in the midst of all of these activities in connection with this syndicate? What role do you think he may play, who's one of the few people still living out of this cabal? What do you think his exposure is here?
Okay, first of all, I have my recorded interviews with your veteran investigative journalist, Robert Parry. I approached him, and him and I shared our evidence together. He gave me all the memos showing that Rupert Murdoch was bankrolling Project Democracy for Oliver North and Walter Remand for William Casey for the foundation.
Tell people what that was.
It was a foundation and front for bankrolling Iran-Contra. Second, in return, he was given citizenship in 1982 so that he could buy the American newspapers. Third, I have his annual reports. His number one client in America is James Baker. And now I'll let you know something else to prove that it goes to George Bush. When I was destroyed in 2001 the second time by CIA, NSA and the Johns Hopkins board, where A.B. Krongard was exposed on TV, I was rescued by a man called Nikola Banisevic. He witnessed the whole thing. He was really sympathetic and asked me to come and work for him. It turns out he owned the banks that was moving all the gold bullion through Montenegro, Yugoslavia, and he had partnerships with Kissinger and Associates. He built the bunkers for Saddam Hussein, the airports. He was also the personal advisor to Colonel Gaddafi, his personal advisor. I have his bank accounts. He's passed away. He said, I was approached in London by President George H.W. Bush asking him to work for him directly, to move his family across to Virginia and work for him. I have his bank accounts of moving all the gold bullion with the ambassador of Kuwait and the rebuilding of the Kuwait dinar with Leo Wanta and the through Citibank. More important, what's really good, he told me before he died that he was using the Promus SWIFT banking software to do the SWIFT transfers. I have all of his bank accounts, the transactions, the dates and times, and proof of his banks being used. And I have the press releases in Europe and America confirming that he was also an arms dealer working for CIA to help them acquire all the Soviet technologies for CIA. I have the press releases on everything. So he was working for George Bush Sr. directly to do this. I have the bank accounts, the court cases, the testimonies, and the only other person that has a copy is Henry Kissinger in his private library.
Okay.
And I got the evidence from the Russian who was suing and trying to file a RICO claim of corruption against CIA for stealing all of the gold bullion from his gold mines in Russia. And he's given that all to me with the letters that they wrote to George Bush Jr. raising this, and I've got the letters to Bill Clinton identifying all the bank accounts.
Well, let me ask you this, Peter, sort of in closing here on this session, what is the name of the trust that the Bush family has to which they were directing so much of these many billions of dollars to their private income? What is the name of that trust?
The transactions for the $6 trillion of gold bullion at Citibank and JP Morgan, I traced all the people involved in that to a company called Ignite Inc., founded by Neil Bush, George Bush, Barbara Bush, Michael Milken, and also the ambassador of Kuwait, and also an Egyptian who was moving $650 billion of gold bullion for President Murabak of Egypt, and 2 Russian mafia are all the founders of that company. It's supposed to be an education company. Now, I can speak to you, but who in the hell serves as the most powerful people in the world and wants to run an education company? It's a front. It's an absolute
so it's
front.
Ignite.
It's called Ignite Inc.
IGNITE.
apostrophe and then Inc. The other director on Ignite Inc. is the attorney Ed Rogers, who resigned from working for President Bush 2 weeks before Danny's murdered, and he's appointed to represent Adnan Kamal, the Saudi intelligence director of BCCI. And Michael Milken is on the director there. Well, the evidence was overwhelming in Senator Kerry's investigation that the money laundering of Noriega's drugs and $60 billion of fraudulent Drexel bonds was going through Capcom, which is owned by BCCI and the Kuwait royal family, through the Chicago Exchange.
That's the story, gang, in that we're saying that, that as a jury sitting in the box, you need to determine whether or not you are going to try to return a verdict in this case. And so I'm proposing that you do this. You review the podcasts that have been made available by Peter Osborne, that you check out the other installments of the Covert Action Bulletin, but that you stay focused on what we've told you here today, and you decide yourself whether or not you intend to do anything about this, because there should be an additional follow-up to the Octopus Murders that does not end with this kind of iffy proposition of maybe Danny Casolaro was murdered, maybe he committed suicide, that there needs to be a follow-up Emmy award-winning documentary laying out the evidence that we've laid out for you today.
In closing, Peter, can you please tell our audience how they can follow your important work? You have all these podcasts on a website and all of these source documents.
Yes. It's called The Sixth Eye. That's THESIXTHEY.org. There is all the documentary evidence there. There's over 54 podcasts. All the evidence is there for everyone to see. And I dedicated the website to Danny Casolaro and Trey Casolaro, who's been trying to win justice for his father. His father was a brilliant investigator, and he gave his life to reveal the truth. And I think that the evidence is, and on the sixth eye, I state categorically, you can only control a country when you control justice and the media. And I want the audience to know that you're at that same position today. What happened to Danny Casolaro?
Ours and our guests, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here today by Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Thank you.